I came to the JRPG genre pretty late. I'm too young to have experienced the golden ages of Final Fantasy or Dragon Quest, and the games that did fit my generation, like Persona, Octopath, and Yakuza, took me years to eventually get into. I did have a brief addiction to Pokemon growing up, but even that was mostly focused on the anime and trading card game. For a long time, I held to the common opinion that this was an outdated genre, one with an uninteresting gameplay loop and a discombobulated approach to storytelling. It wasn't until I actually played one that I realized how wrong I had been. Not only can these games be ridiculously fun, but they can also have some of the most memorable storylines you'll see in a video game. And those things go hand in hand. I found that even stories that are technically kind of bad have a certain appeal when they're put in the JRPG format. And on the flip side, games with admittedly poor turn-based combat can still be incredibly engrossing for their storylines. This was, I have to admit, a little shocking to me. I had been raised on Western single-player games. Stuff like Uncharted, Batman Arkham, and early Assassin's Creed. These games all followed what I'd call the Western philosophy for video game storytelling, crafting cohesive and unified experiences, with cinematic cutscenes transitioning seamlessly from gameplay, and gameplay that strives to look like cinema. Western developers have historically strived to draw as thin of a line between gameplay and story as possible, to make the entire experience feel interconnected. And I'm not here to knock this approach. It's created incredibly polished, memorable, and emotionally powerful experiences. But I gotta be honest, there is a narrative appeal with the JRPG approach that I don't think the Western format could ever hope to capture. And that's not to say that every story-focused game should be a JRPG, or even that it's the best approach for every story. It'd be absurd for me to insist that The Last of Us would be better with turn-based combat. But I don't think it's a coincidence that the games that can most confidently market themselves off of their story are all JRPGs. Now, these games take the opposite approach that Western developers do. The line between gameplay and story is much starker. Cutscenes noticeably halt and interrupt gameplay, and the gameplay itself has this unmistakably systematic feel to it that Western devs have been running away from for decades now. And the pacing of these games allow for hour-plus sequences of pure gameplay, followed by cutscenes that sometimes border on 30 minutes. All of this should make for a jarring and discombobulated experience. But there is a surprising way in which all of it, taken together, helps the player become deeply immersed into both the gameplay and the story. The two broad pillars with which any good JRPG is built upon, combat and story, are very distinct from each other. But they still end up complementing each other to build really memorable experiences. And I want to explore why that is. Now, there are a lot of small ways that JRPGs facilitate better storytelling than their competitors. For one, a turn-based combat system naturally evokes a feeling of camaraderie and teamwork that other systems just can't replicate. The movesets, strategies, and animations in a good turn-based combat system can really focus in and emphasize each character's personality, which can obviously elevate a character-centered story. JRPGs, especially newer ones, have also perfected pacing, which is obviously an important aspect for good storytelling. Atlas Games in particular has mastered changing the pace of gameplay constantly to keep the player engaged in diverting systems. Although here, I should note that this isn't a quality exclusive to JRPGs. The Uncharted franchise is about as cinematic as you can get, but it is also notorious for having excellent pacing between combat, traversal, and a story. JRPGs are also famous for their length, and there is real narrative potential that comes from crafting a 100-hour story. Though, here again, this may be something that the JRPG format can do particularly well, but they don't do it exclusively. You can pump out a hyper-cinematic Western game with a 100-hour campaign. You just need to have the budget and manpower and ethical leniency of Rockstar Games, but it can be done. Other mediums can also push out stuff like this more reliably and ethically. Shows and books have produced 50 to 60-hour epics for decades now. So, all of these elements certainly elevate JRPG stories, but I don't think any of them really get at the root of what makes this genre so narratively rich. For that, we need to get back to the gameplay story divide I discussed earlier. From the outside, the sharp contrast between story and gameplay in a JRPG appears to make for a disunified experience. But anyone who's played a good JRPG knows that these pillars feel very natural going together. Though it's certainly not the kind of cohesion that you get out of, say, a Naughty Dog game, where you can hardly tell the difference sometimes between gameplay and a story. No, the JRPG approach is more complementary. Something just feels right about jumping between combat, exploration, and cutscenes, even as they are all noticeably distinct from one another. But why do they feel right together? Well, to answer that, let's look a bit deeper into the progression systems of these games. More and more, Western developers have pushed for their games to be built off of multiple mechanical systems. Usually, it's something like stealth, traversal, and combat. And this is their answer to the problem of pacing. Constantly switching up gameplay is supposed to keep the player engaged. Progression for these games is then typically disjointed between the 3 to 4 central mechanics they have. Upgrading your traversal capacities has little effect on how you play out a combat encounter. But JRPGs, on the other hand, are almost always centrally focused on one system: turn-based combat. That's not to say that turn-based combat is the only system they have. These games still break up play by including extensive and detailed progression systems for their combat, such that the player is usually spending just as much time improving their combat capabilities as they are engaged in combat. And these games' progression systems aren't just about stat crunching and grinding. The best JRPGs center their progression systems on giving the player new and inventive ways to hit the enemy, rather than just making them hit them harder. And it's this unifying approach to progression which makes JRPGs incredibly polished and satisfying. I'd compare it to watching a really good film that has all of its plotting, cinematography, and acting unified around a singular theme. Similarly, everything in a JRPG is unified around a single system. Everything, including the story. That may not sound right at first, but just think about it. If the story of a JRPG shows my team befriending a new person, I now have a new party member to play with in combat encounters. If one of them dies, I lose a party member. Dramatic character moments are almost always accompanied with said character learning a new combat mechanic. Dramatic confrontations with villains are almost always accompanied with a boss battle. The story is, in one sense, serving the progression systems. But experientially, what's happening is that my engagement with the story becomes completely tied up with my engagement with the mechanics. This unifying approach to game design is just ridiculously engrossing to get lost in. It's why these games can go on for 100 hours without becoming boring. And Western video games, as much as I do love them, just cannot reach this level of unity with their format. A cutscene may be aesthetically linked with what I just did in gameplay, but really, they don't have much to do with each other. A shocking character death won't change how I approach the next encounter. Neither will an extra person joining my crew change much beyond just adding another CPU to follow me around. And how many big villains are dealt away with in cutscenes in Western games? So, while Western games may look cohesive, they really aren't cohesive under the hood. But it goes deeper than that. Mechanics tell stories, and the progression mechanics of a JRPG just so happens to tell precisely the same story that is typically told in this genre. You ever wonder why so many JRPGs tell coming-of-age stories? This is why. Take Persona 4, a story about characters confronting their shadows and maturing to who they're meant to be, with a gameplay loop centered on characters first witnessing a literal boss battle take place against their shadow, and then going through a leveling system that allows their kit to slowly progress into its most optimal setup. PlayStation Studios have taken great strides to make sure their mechanics match the atmosphere and feel of their story. And it really is impressive what they've accomplished. But only a JRPG could create a near one-to-one match between what the player experiences and what the story shows. And that's why I consider the JRPG to still be the top dog for video game storytelling. I freely admit that other genres allow for much more variety in what kind of stories they tell, and have a kind of aesthetic beauty that JRPGs can only ever really rarely hope to match. But when it comes down to it, there's nothing that can crystallize the surprisingly perfect harmony between deep systemization and ever-personal growth like the JRPG.